this next session will be moderated by Umar Yakubu, who is Executive Director, Center for Fiscal Transparency and Integrity Watch. Kindly make welcome with me, Umar Yakubu. Thank you very much for joining us, sir. And to join him on that panel, we have Abimbola Olofure Wycliffe, who is the head, Technology and Investment, United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Let's please celebrate her as she steps forward. Thank you very much for coming all the way. Also on this panel, we have Lola Kanye, who is the African Program Director, Center for International Private Enterprise, CeFTIW. Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you. And then we have a policy analyst, Development Reimagined, and that's Ovigwe Eguegu. I think we'd need you to later on just pronounce your name. So we'll just raise it Eguegu or Eguegu. How exactly is it? Eguegu. Thank you very much. And then we have Taiwo Hassan Adebayo of the Associated Press. Thank you. Taiwo Hassan Adebayo, are you in the building? All right. Okay, let's do that. Okay. Well, it's good to know that Umar Yakubu specializes in the area of data science, the criminal justice system, financial crimes, and national security. He has degrees from Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, Nasarawa State University, University of Chester, University of Leicester, University of Portsmouth in the UK. We can go on and on, so you're sure that you're in great hands to handle this session. And Abimbola Olofure Wycliffe is an international development and energy expert with more than 20 years of experience. She's worked extensively on sustainable development initiatives for about 15 years. She'll be bringing all of that experience into this session today. And Lola Kanye leads the business, integrity, and anti-corruption programs in Africa at the Center for International Private Enterprise. She's a licensed attorney, a member of the New York State Bar and the Nigerian Bar with more than a decade experience as a corporate attorney and compliance specialist. Thank you very much for joining us today. Ovigwe Eguegu is an analyst with a special focus on geopolitics, diplomacy, and international institutions. And his thematic areas of expertise include African Union, Africa-Chad, China relations. Of course, he's frequently quoted on different media platforms. And then, of course, Taiwo Hassan Adebayo is from the Associated Press. The topic that would be discussing on this session is corrosive and constructive capital inflow in Africa, regulatory frameworks, and governance gaps. Over to you, Mr. Yakubu.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, moderator, and thank you. Everybody has already been introduced, so I think we'll just go to the heat of the matter to start discussing these issues. So our topic for today is the corrosive capital that's been coming to Nigeria. That's why I assume it has been coming to Nigeria. We all know Nigeria is a developing economy like every other African country. We're all struggling, we're looking for money. Right in the Fourth Republic, from President Obasanjo, when he came into power, one of the things he was doing was always traveling around the world looking for foreign direct investment. The same thing was happening with, after him, President Eradua, President Jonathan, President Muhammadu Buhari. And right now, as we speak, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is in Saudi looking for foreign direct investment. So it's the things we have been doing for the last 20 to 23 years. So, but which is true, Nigeria or African countries need this money. So we knew because we have a deficit in financing in our infrastructure. We just finished a session on healthcare, and most of the panelists were discussing on why we need a lot of funding, especially in the rural areas. So it's very critical that we look for this funding to cover the deficit. Second issue is when you bring in such funds, it comes with technology. So Nigeria stands to benefit if people bring in their funds because, like the Chinese, when they are bringing money, they usually come with their equipment and it comes from some technology, some form of transfer. So people get some jobs to do and improve our economy. And right now, I'm not sure today. I think the dollar exchanges for 1,000, 1,001, 1,002. Well, it's over 1,000, and that's not good. And the only way you can stabilize your forex is when in economics they call it import-export. You have your balance of trade. You have enough of forex coming in, so you have a good balance of trade, so that you stabilize your forex. And naturally, when you bring in a lot of money, an avenue to to generate taxes, because when people invest in your economy, they pay taxes, so it's good for the economy. So on a general note, it's very good. It's a good thing to have foreign capital come into our country, but it comes with its own problems, which I feel is one of the reasons why we are here to discuss these issues, to think about the problems and how we intend to solve them. Like one of the last questions speakers said, we are looking for solutions. That's why we're here. So I think not in any particular order, but it would be okay to start with the woman on my immediate right, Madam Abimbola Wycliffe. She's the head of technology and investment of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. And I'll put the first question to you. You come from a development finance institution as an international organization. Right around COVID area, a lot of countries were in problem, and they ran to the Washington, to the IMF, to the World Bank to complain that, look, we cannot pay our debts, we have so many problems. What, in your view, do you think we can do, or Nigeria or African countries? How can we manage this kind of crisis? Because let's say when the COVID came, we were struggling. How do you think Nigeria can do better to ensure that this kind of capital, when it comes, we can retain it in Nigeria so that it doesn't go out? Because when we had the COVID crisis, every country was looking for money, and monies were being pulled out, where some economists will call it hot money. So monies were being taken back to those countries. So coming from a development financial institution, I don't know what your views
All right, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. To speak to your question, I think so interventions at the sovereign level, as we saw during COVID, are a good thing for developing countries because at the least it helped us to spread pretty much the commitments that we had financially. We were able to meet the vulnerabilities that COVID exposed at the time without having to dip into our own pockets. And that said, for developing countries, there's already existing debt for most of them. For the DSSI, for example, it was extended to 72 countries, but probably just about 43 countries took advantage of it. It's kind of like a sweet and sour opportunity, I would say, because on the one hand, it's good to be able to access, funds. It's good to be able to access intervention funds that come like that and they are targeted. What would make it, worth the while or worth the take is how we, first and foremost, have articulated the need of the country and how we're going to spend the money. Transparency of the entire process and the accountability is very key. So when this is all lined up, then it's a good thing to have. But what we find in developing countries most of the time is when this money comes, it's almost like, what did you call it? You called it hot money. And then, it's also spent like that without due diligence and accountability. And at the end of the day, I think sometimes you find that it actually reduces the credit rating of the countries. It makes the countries more indebted because this has not been structured properly, and to make it worth the while, I think we have to be very intentional as a country, or as African countries, or as developing countries, to ensure that what it is that this hot money is going to be used for, how it is going to be accounted for, must be clear cut, and we must ensure that the funds deliver, the purpose for which it was taken. If we look at the COVID one, we had the the economic sustainability plan and the funds that came into the health sector. We are 3 years after COVID, and we are struggling to see one center of excellence where those funds went into. If we look across Africa, for example, we are not able to even see it. There was the whole catalyzing the market for pretty much pandemic mitigants, that I will call it, but we're not seeing them tangibly. But still, that said, in other countries, you find out that there were so many things that happened based on the influx of funds that came for COVID. So the COVID intervention funds actually were used to build better healthcare centers. They were used to actually start to help the economy to diversify. And when you look at North African countries, for example, they actually started looking at boosting and extending the scale at which drugs were being produced. Now, not just any other drug, but looking to ramp up, production of active pharmaceutical ingredients, so that we don't have to rely on other countries, in the event that there's a pandemic again. So just to, in a nutshell, accountability, transparency of, the fund, how it's going to be utilized, and actually ensuring that those funds, are not diverted, right, is what will make it worth the take.
Thank you very much. And picking from what you just said, we're back to the realm of the discussion, talking about accountability, transparency. I'll come to you, Madam Lola Kanye. Did I get the name correctly? Thank you. From the Center for International Private Enterprise. I believe your organization does a lot of work around seeing the kind of funds that flows into different countries, especially a developing economy like Nigeria. What do you think we can do as a continent to promote accountable investments in Nigeria? Where, like, from what the last speaker said, it is hard to see what has been done in terms of, let's say, the COVID funding that has come to Nigeria. So what do you think we can do? There are different aspects to do to help in promoting accountable investments in Africa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yakubu. And I do want to, commend CJID, since this is the first time that I'm addressing, this crowd, for a very, good job of putting together a really diverse conversation and slotting in this conversation that really will sound very academic. But it's very, very pertinent to every sector of our economies across Africa. And it's one that we actually need to elevate to a point where we start to learn a bit more about this concept of what we call, Mr. Yakubu is referring to accountable investment, we call it constructive investment. The flip side of constructive investment would be corrosive investment. That's a term that CeFTIW developed starting around 2015 through 2018, when we started to observe that when investments flow to African countries, many of us know that Africa is a net creditor to the world. We talk about that, which means a lot of our resources have been financial resources have been funneled to many countries that are a bit more stable and invested there. However, as Mr. Yakubu was mentioning, since 1999, we've had presidents who are very active about going outside to look for investment in a country that exports much of the resources that could be mobilized at home, right? And so what we observed in 2015 is when African countries take a loan and invest in public infrastructure projects versus when a more stable country with sound democratic institutions, clear, transparent public procurement processes, when they take loans, the returns in terms of social and economic indicators to those countries with sound rule of law is much higher than the returns to African nations. And we started to ask ourselves why. Capital is neutral. If $500 billion is invested in Nigeria, $500 billion is invested in, we were talking about Morocco, for a closer to home, example, or even pick a European country. The outcome of that $500 billion should be evident. If it's invested in transportation, then small and mid-sized enterprises should be able to, at a cheaper cost, transport their goods to market and make more money. We're talking about health just a few minutes before. Maternal mortality rate should go down in some communities because now there's easier access to primary healthcare facilities in those rural areas. But that doesn't translate in Africa. And so we started to ask ourselves why. And it boils down to weak rule of law and democratic institutions. That's what it comes down to. I will challenge you if you have your smartphones, right? It's not even a challenge. I'll invite you to pick up your phones and even just search for, you've heard white elephant projects, right? Abandoned projects in our country. And if you do that, you'll see maybe the top 10 or top 20 abandoned projects. And what you will realize is that frequently, 8 out of 10 times, we make these good investments in public infrastructure projects in our country. We end up paying more for them. I'll give you one example. How many of you know the Ajaokuta Steel project? Now, think about Ajaokuta Steel and think about a fairly small state in the northeast of the US, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania built that entire economy on steel. As of 1994, Ajaokuta Steel Company was 98% developed and ready for export. As of 1994, 98%. It was estimated about under $700 million to build that plant. We've spent $700 million, right? We've spent more than $8 billion. Even President Buhari refused to pump more money into it in his tenure because he couldn't explain where all those resources have gone. Why? Weak democratic institutions and weak rule of law. Rule of law includes all of the things that ensures that when we get the investment, when we get the funding from whatever donor agency, we know where those funds are going. We know what the returns we should expect are, or what returns we should expect from those funds in terms of the social impact, in terms of the economic impact, and we follow through. So that, as the commissioner who sat here earlier was talking about her KPIs, so that if we don't see those returns, the democratic institutions are strong enough to help us track and make someone accountable. That is accountable investment. And so in a nutshell, it sounds a bit more complicated, but when we have more time, I'll give you an analogy of how every one of us has a role to play, especially journalists, academia, and development partners.
Yeah, we'll come to that. Thank you very much. Picking from where Madam Lola spoke, I'll come to you, Mr. Taiwo from Associated Press. I believe you're a media organization that's in every country of the world, because every time you are looking at news sources, you see them, Associated Press, Associated Press. So picking from what she just said, what do you think from your own reporting, what do other African countries, what have they done so well that when you invest $500 million, like she said, you see it on the ground? But in Nigeria, there's a deficit. What do you think they are doing? Because we're here to improve ourselves. So what are other countries doing very well, apart from what she has identified as weak institutions coming from having a weak rule of law system? So what have they done that we can learn from and improve our own? Thank you, Mr.
Yeah, thank you very much. I should say first that my participation on this panel follows my research with CJ Heidi and CEIP, not essentially because of my reporting for the Associated Press. And of course, you are correct. AP is everywhere. Now, about what some African countries do different from Nigeria. There are not many examples out there, actually, in other African countries. I think in sub-Saharan Africa, we have similar issue, especially around financing on one hand from authoritarian regimes like China and from other sources like AFDB, like World Bank. And that's the main thrust of the research that I've carried out with CJID, which examines Chinese financing in Nigeria using the constructive capital, corrosive capital framework and comparing that with other sources like AFDB, like World Bank. So what we have seen clearly is that the contributions from China have clearly helped raise infrastructure development curve. You can see railway, you can see bridge, you can see Zungeru, you can see all these things. But if you take a critical look, there are costs. And my research highlights these issues around transparency, governance, democratic governance, human rights. I will give a couple of examples. Now, if Nigeria wants to be the road, normally, let's say Ministry of Work, advertise, there will be bidding process, DPP would do some scrutiny, National Assembly will pass the budget in which you would have the provision for that amount. But if we are having a road that will be financed using capital from China, for instance, one, there would scarcely be National Assembly scrutiny. Two, there will not be BPP scrutiny. So what you have is that the funder, that is China, select the contractor in Beijing. So that brushes aside Nigeria's public procurement law, which emphasizes competition. And if you have competition, that helps the local firms in Nigeria. Everybody has a kind of fair opportunity to compete. You do not have that, with all this Chinese loan-tied project. Also, that's for democratic governance because it doesn't involve our own local institutions like the National Assembly, like the Bureau of Public Procurement. Also, if you compare this project with, let's say, Nigeria Transmission Expansion Project being implemented by TCN, Transmission Company of Nigeria, and funded by AFDB, or Nigerian Expansion Electricity Project being implemented by Rural Electricity Agency and funded by the World Bank, would hardly see documents readily available like feasibility study, like ESIA, Environmental and Social Impact Assessment. And they appear theoretical, but they are very important. Because if you have EIA in public, it means that civil society groups will have a basis to uphold accountability. If you're having projects, it means that some communities will be affected, some individuals will be affected. What happens to them in the name of development? You understand? So you don't have those things, If you look, if you are talking about this big railway project tied to Chinese laws, but compare that with the electricity expansion project being implemented by TCN, flagship for constructive capital, for beneficial capital. Again, an example, TCN is resettling communities affected. But it's not just doing it alone unilaterally, it's inviting interest from NGOs and come and look at it. Because those people, maybe because of education, because of economic issues and all that, they may not have the voice of their own. But, you have NGOs who can, help them press for accountability. So those are the issues that we have seen. So concisely in sum, while this financing from authoritarian regime like China has helped, raise infrastructure curve, you can see your railway and all that, it has costs. protecting transparency, human rights, democratic governance. And it's not only in Nigeria, because you started with Africa, it affects other African countries too. In DR Congo, for instance, where you have resource-backed loans, copper and cobalt to go into repaying loan. That country is saying now that, look, we are paying so much more than we have collected from you because we are using our resources. And you must have heard what AFDB said recently. These resource-backed loans are a disaster for Africa. So we have to, as a country and Africa writ large, first, we have to strengthen our own institutions. And to do that, we also have to increase our own capacity to mobilize resources domestically, cut waste, so that we will have stronger fiscal space, and our desperation to get this detrimental investment would reduce. We would be able to, stand on a stronger ground to negotiate. Okay, if we are having projects in our country tied to loan, PPP has to be involved. There has to be competitive bidding. Our own local firms have to, compete. And lastly, let me mention this. Argument has also been made that this criticism about of Chinese financing Nigeria, it's unwise, kind of making the West look good and all that. And they say that the good thing about not giving money to Nigeria, rather you are giving money to contractor that, in 2 years you can see your road, you can see your bridge and all that, is that you are removing the risk of corruption. Yeah, that sounds right on the surface. But if you look critically, it's not so, because we have seen reports, I have conducted investigations. I used to lead investigations at Premium Times, and we have seen that these funds go to the construction company directly, not Nigerian government, but Nigerian officials nominate those who collect subcontract from these companies, thereby, still allowing, money laundering. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, but I still won't let you go, because what we're discussing, a round of applause for people. We're discussing corrosive capital here, and from what Madam Lola said earlier on, corrosive capital meaning is toxic in a sense. So if you are advocating for, let's say, the Chinese loans, which seems not to be embedded, there is delivery of the service. But there are countries now complaining about their sovereignty being threatened. There are a lot of programs on BBC where, because they cannot pay those loans, those countries' assets are tied to those things. If I'm pushing this, I hope it's not a hard question. Their sovereignty. So on one end, there's capital illicit financial flow. That's what we're used to from, let's say, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Now you have switched to China. China is now taking over your country in terms of assets. So how do we balance it? And now we may have solved the infrastructure problem. Yes, you have the infrastructure, but your sovereignty is threatened. And I think Zambia has complained. If I'm correct, Malawi has complained, because some of those loans are tied to their own sovereignty. So I don't know what your comments are on that, or what to do, because the issue is usually lack of transparency that breeds these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I think first, because recently you have this issue of sovereign immunity being waived in Nigeria and all that. If you have loan agreements like that, you have to enter kind of agreements that in case of default, you have to waive your sovereign immunity, so that a kind of arbitration would happen. That's normal. But it's an issue because this project, this financing, many times not respond to need, do not respond to market need, do not respond to economic need. Therefore, if you get loan to, let's say, let's just use Nigeria's railway project, the 500 million loan tied Abuja metro service, for instance. Now, that's an economic thing. That's an economic project. And repaying that loan, proceed from selling tickets, from adverts at stations and all that, should flow back into repaying the loan. But that project has not worked since 2020. Nobody has used the metro service in Abuja since 2020. So what does that mean? It means that that's tightening difficulty for recipients. It means that taxpayers, revenue from taxpayers, revenue from oil business would go into repaying the loan, and that now worsens our fiscal situation. It becomes difficult to build health infrastructure. It becomes difficult to finance education, because the money you are making from oil, from taxes you are collecting, it's going back into repaying the loan. It's a very serious problem for Nigeria, because the project, we don't even see the feasibility studies. We are not getting the proceeds from this project. The Lagos Ibadan line, we took 1.2 billion US dollars for that project. That's the busiest corridor in Nigeria. The train runs twice a day. So what problem has it solved? How much are they making from it for a place like Lagos Ibadan? So you still have people who still have to depend on the road. When that project was coming, we thought that people could work in Ibadan, could live in Ibadan and work in Lagos. You will have fast train that will take you in the morning to Lagos. But you can't do that now, because it runs just twice a day, and it runs for more than 2 hours. So if these projects are efficient, the issue of defaulting would be minimal, because it means that we can make money from the project, and then that will flow back into repaying the loan. Yeah, and in other African countries, I think that's the problem they have got, the efficiency, the effectiveness of this project.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Taiwo. Going from Mr. Taiwo, Mr. Eguegu, sorry, as well. It's evident that there is a due diligence issue when foreign companies are coming to do business. And I'll just remind you of a recent case in the newspapers. I think Premium Times reported it on the P&ID case. There was a lack of due diligence where capital was supposed to come in to invest in a gas project in Calabar, which failed. You have the Malabu, is the same. There's another one in Taraba. There's a power project in Taraba. There are so many, about 20 of them now, that are subject of litigation in the UK. And right now, Nigeria is paying millions of dollars. In fact, before the exit of the last government, they paid about $500 million on such kind of judgment debts because of failed contracts. So in your own view, Mr. Eguegu, what do you think African governments can do to encourage responsible corporate behavior from these foreign investors in our country? Yes, Madam has already spoken about our weak rule of law, so we're already aware of that. So what else do you think we can do so that we ensure that there's responsibility of these companies that are so-called bringing in money to invest, but sometimes we don't see nothing from it? And of recent, like these examples I gave, the P&ID, where we would have lost $11.9 billion, Nigeria would have actually paid money for nothing being done. So that's even what's happening as a result of the weak governance structures we have. Thank you, Mr. Eguegu.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks to CGID for the invitation to join you today. With regards to infrastructure or investment, I think it's very crucial that like Mr. Taiwo said, that it has to be on a needs basis. Because if your economy needs it, and if it's necessary for national development, automatically you know that you have a project that is viable. The feasibility study will just say very, very clearly. And I think that also touched on the issue of transparency also. He also said something that's also very pertinent, which is the issue of contracts and whether people are actually aware of what the terms and the conditions are. And I think that is very, very crucial. Whether in Nigeria, this is a common issue all across developing countries. We are just even here very recently now about the standard gauge railway in Kenya. An official came on radio last week, Monday, to say that the government actually paid more than 100% of what they're supposed to pay. 50 billion Kenyan shillings was what they were supposed to pay per the agreement, and they end up paying about 500. You can imagine, yeah, the major difference. So that is he can say that, but he said that after years of pressure. He said that based on the document that were released in 2022, and those documents were released in 2022 after years of pressure from Kenyan civil society on the government of Uhuru Kenyatta, who was the president then, to release the contract behind the standard gauge railway. And there was a lot of reluctance. Officials will go on to tell you, oh, it's about national interest, national security. We don't want the case where, one official actually said that the deal that they had is so sensitive that if they release the document, a neighboring country who is negotiating similar transportation infrastructure may actually end up being offended that the kind of term that Kenya got is different from the kind of term that they are getting. So, well, yes, that is very possible because each country cannot have the same level of capacity in terms of negotiation and to get outcomes from these deals, whether it's state-backed loans or coming from private sector or even development institutions like World Bank and IMF and AFDB, right? So yes, like as has been said before, regulation is very key. Not just having the laws there, but also the enforcement. If I have a house and I say these are the rules, and everybody knows the rules, they prepare with those rules and then they come, but I don't enforce the rules, of course, it is seen like those rules are not, they're just on paper. So I think the enforcement of the rules and the regulation is very crucial. Those who are acting in a malign way are held accountable. I think that's a very important point to make. If you have white elephant projects, people sign the document for those projects, right? And people push for those projects. Have they been held accountable? That's another very, very important point. And in the also, before we even get to the project, the process, was there enough dialogue? Was there enough engagement with communities, with civil society? Most of the time, the civil society comes when the project is failing and there is a lot of pressure, and then they start agitating for contracts to be released. But if you have them in the stage of process of negotiation, or the process where this project are being done, then you don't have to wait until there's a default, or there's a problem in the first place. So they have to act from that preventive approach, and to these issues. And then, I think also the strengthening of institutional capacity and their independence, because you might have situations where the rules are there, there's readiness, or there's a political will there is a incentive to investigate and to expose, but there's no political will. And lack of political will means those who are supposed to do the investigations are not going to do the investigation because they are afraid of what can happen, to them, to their jobs and things like that. So these are some of the issues I think all around that governments can do, to solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eguegu. Thank you. I'll still come back to you, Madam. You are working with a UN body, and I know the UN is mostly concerned about poverty levels. We just finished about maternal mortality levels now. So what do you think, what are your thoughts? I want your thoughts on the effects of this foreign direct investment or foreign inflows on wealth distribution on African countries, because there are a lot of allegations that sometimes it facilitates illicit financial flows. So I wanted your thoughts on how this foreign direct investment affects wealth distribution amongst African countries.
Thanks for your question. Of course, first and foremost, what we have is enhanced liquidity when you have FDI, and if properly targeted, of course, it creates economic empowerment, and it's something that is I guess the quickest thing to leverage by small and medium enterprise, because for the FDIs, a lot of times when they come, even coming in as big investors, they help to catalyze growth in ecosystems and specific value chains. And if that's, kind of like cascades down, then you find everybody within that value chain being empowered to drive industrialization and scale. So that is, for me, what FDI is supposed to do. FDI should not be structured without any plans for economic empowerment in any way. And when you're looking at economic empowerment, it has to be targeted. So it's either you're bringing in FDI for infrastructure development towards a particular goal, but at the end of the day, it has to have an end game of, either extending the particular value chain or strengthening that value chain. So be it agriculture, be it healthcare, be it transportation, it has to have a definite end game, and everybody within that ecosystem you have to make sure that that funding cascades through to all the participants in the ecosystem. So another thing that we see is that it also helps to, apart from the liquidity, there is, if it comes in like through multilaterals, we find out that there's access, right? Because one of the things that inhibits economic development is the fact that our SMEs, our enterprises, do not have access to financing. But when it comes through like the multilaterals, the DFIs, there's a way that it is structured where, just like my esteemed contributor said earlier, that the funding can actually go to a business, to an enterprise, or it is structured in such a way that the businesses, the enterprises can actually draw down, right, and pay back, in a way that is equitable for everyone. And that means for the bigger populace, there's benefits. The issues that we have with FDI is a lot of times it lacks long-term strategies, and we have to make sure that FDIs, begin to have long-term strategies. We need to ensure that, from what we have seen, historical trends-wise, we haven't managed our debts very well. We have to have a strategy on how to manage the debt, how to disburse it, what commodities is it going to go into, what price, I mean, pretty much you look at a commodity and it has a price boom. How do we fund that, and how does it provide like temporary relief? Right now, we're going through a period in Nigeria where FDI would have been critical to achieve now. And of course, that's why the president is going around. But the real issue, the elephant in the room, is that we've actually catalyzed a lot of funding in the last 20 years that has not spiraled up to, anything tangible. So we have also the issue around, so pretty much right now, if it comes in, a short-term liquidity risk is mitigated for us. But then, if we do not have a long-range planning, if we do not have an end game that is long-term, like how do you utilize this? What type of funding comes after that, right? And what then do we do with whatever revenue is generated with this FDI? How do we put that back into the economy, and how do we use that to sustain the system? If we do not have that, then we cannot utilize our FDIs accurately.
Thank you very much. A round of applause for her. I think she made some valid comments on how we can utilize most of the money that comes to Nigeria. Okay, drawing from what Madam Abimbola said, I'll come to you, Madam Lola. Given an example of during the COVID-19, a lot of Nigerians complained that their BVNs were collected, their account numbers were collected, but most said they did not receive anything. That's on one side. On the other side, we are now being told we have a loan of XYZ from the multilaterals, like she said, and those monies came from the World Bank. I think last week or 2 weeks ago, the president sought another approval for $800 million or so, I'm not sure about the amount, on the same process. So if you count them, all these interventions, they total over $5 billion, I think, from COVID-19 to date, probably more than that. And Nigerians and the civil society are complaining they have not received any kind of funding for that purpose. So in your own view, what do you think civil society, CGID, the media, everybody, what role do you think they can play actively to ensure that such monies, which are loans, and we're going to pay back those loans, how can we effectively monitor those kind of those kind of loans so that they are distributed properly and will affect the wealth distribution that Madam Abimbola just spoke about? Mind you, the last meeting they had, I learned the governors insisted that they wanted to be the ones that even wanted to distribute those loans. So if the federal government has not managed to do it very well, I am skeptical that the state government has the necessary structure to do it properly. So I just wanted your view on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last panel, if you remember, one of the things they emphasized was data and the credibility of data. And this has been an issue. We have a data scientist on this panel, right? You're asking me a question I should throw back at you. You know, that's still an issue for many African countries. And speaking of Nigeria, where we haven't done a census in how many years? Right? 16 years? Right. And so the skepticism is trite. We're right to be skeptical. In fact, we are right to feel that, you know, there will be no difference if the state governments, or there'll be very little difference if the state governments take over that responsibility. Why do I say that? We knew when the palliatives that were hoarded were raided, and this was the responsibility of state governments to distribute. So the issues that we need to address in this context that you've pulled out as an analogy for the bigger context of corrosive capital that we're talking about requires civil society to collaborate as actively as those who are effective about stealing our country's resources. And in collaborating actively, I think there are 4 things that we need to think about, because we've learned over the years from the pattern of investment in our countries, and these investments just flowing right back out to the countries where they came from, or to the regions where they came from. They come from, you know, often Western donors, and they flow right back out to those countries indirectly. And I think if we think about it, my colleagues here talked about the fact that there's often not sufficient or any needs assessment before a government says we need to build a road, we need to build an airport. Sierra Leone is an example, trite example, just before the current president entered office. There was an airport that was, the second airport was proposed to be built by the Chinese investors who did the feasibility studies. The same person giving you the money did the feasibility studies and said, this thing you'll pay back in less than 10 years. Much less than 10 years. And then an independent party did the feasibility study and said, you actually don't need an airport. Your current airport is underutilized, and you'll make more from utilizing your current airport and building ground transportation. Just one example, the standard gauge rail example in Kenya. No environmental assessment was done, environmental impact assessment was done. And when the SGR was being built, a common practice in project infrastructure finance is that you source resources locally for several reasons, and you also hire locally. Hire locally so you can transfer knowledge. You know, nobody builds to operate forever. No foreign investor builds to operate forever. You transfer it to the locals who need to continue utilizing those resources. But most of the resources in the first 5 years, until the private sector took the government to court, were sourced from China. 80% of the resources or more. And these are resources that could have been sourced locally and added value to the local economy. The example my brother also talked about in Abuja and in Lagos of the light rails, because of time, you didn't have the chance to mention that these rails run only twice a day. Oh, did you? Excellent. And we were talking exactly about corrosive capital and constructive capital in Istanbul with my colleagues from CJID, and we were jumping on the trains, going back and forth, and the cost of living was similar to what the cost of living is in Lagos. But we invested 12 times more to build the Abuja light rail than to build the Lagos light rail. In less than a 3-year period, these contracts were negotiated. So the 3 things I think need to change about civil society's approach, or maybe not change but be fine-tuned, is this very proactive and strategic collaboration, and that should be guided by a few mindsets. One is the planning and the strategic evaluation that should happen for project infrastructure, or even any funding coming from foreign investors. Civil society needs to be able to give the government advice on this. And some civil societies do. But when they work alone, their voices are not as loud as when they are collaborating with more partner organizations. Civil society should be able to say to governments, this loan is not in our name because we don't see a needs assessment that is independent. We don't see the long-term plan for how this infrastructure will add social value, economic value over time to our countries. We only see the costs. The capacity to track is also another important thing, the capacity to track the impact of these investments. There's an analogy I would have liked to give, but in the interest of time, I'll stop at the last thing, which is a really critical thing that we're seeing come up in the corrosive, constructive capital space across other regions, including in Africa. African negotiators come with this mindset, and civil society is also alluding to that, with this mindset of we have lower or less or weaker negotiating power. So we just chase the FDI anywhere it comes from, we take it, right? And any form in which it comes, because when FDI used to come to Africa prior to the new patterns we see from China, it could come as grants, it could come as aids. Now it's coming as contracts. And as my brother was saying, when it's a contract, you waive certain public international rights as a nation. And so what's the cost of the investment coming to our countries? Going into negotiation thinking that we have lower or poor negotiating power needs to change, which then also means that we now need to create an attractive environment for FDI. There are investors who do not, Nigeria's bond rating, if you know, it's rated as junk right now, right? And that's our fault. That's just because we haven't created the right environment. But we actually can without investing resources into it, just tightening up the loopholes in our governance systems.
Thank you very much, Lola. I think she needs a round of applause for this. She has told us now where the problems are and what to do. So I'll still come back to you to round up and you tell me the how, because you have now told me what we need to do, and I'll come back to everybody tell us how are we going to do it, because we're here to solve problems. So Mr. Eguegu, well, we need to round up. I heard we need to round up right now. So it's your last question. I want to ask you now, other countries now, and we're trying to strike a balance now. We need the money, let's say from China, we need the investments now, but now we still want to be transparent and not to be corrupt and not to have those effects about illicit financial flows, capital flights, money laundering, sovereignties are being threatened. What do you think, in your own view, how can we balance this? Because if we are taking the money, it's coming with problems. So how do we balance it? Or what do we accept? What do we reject? These are just my question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think overall it's an inside job, because if I'm going to lend XYZ money, I'm not responsible for the regulatory environment. I'm not responsible for fiscal management policy. Nothing. I just have money to give to you based on maybe set international rules or norms or practices in terms of in development finance and all of that. But most of the job actually needs to be done by countries. Like our country, Nigeria, we have so much work to do that we need to do from our own perspective, whether in terms of setting up the rules, of laws, or updating them and enforcing them. Very, 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 very important. And then I think also of crucial is creating a conducive environment and risk, stable. Let's look at an example: the Abuja Kaduna railway. When we had the bomb blast or the bomb blast and slash kidnapping, that was I remember I was out of the country, and when I heard about it, the first thing I thought in my mind was, how are we going to repay the debt? Yeah, because every hour that railway is not generating revenue, your money is accruing, both interest and even that you have to pay. And when every month that wasn't working, I was really concerned. We have to get this thing working as soon as possible. And when you look at the figures, it's really shocking. We had a case where 6.6 billion naira just we lost it in the month. I think about 8 months that it wasn't functioning, and then even now that it started functioning again, because of the fear and risk of kidnapping, the revenue generated has gone down from 500 million naira, to 1 million naira per month. That's significant. So you can say it's already running at a loss. We're not just losing money. We're also going to pay the loan by taking money from somewhere else. So we have to focus on creating an environment that it's conducive for us to be able to make long-term commitments like that, where we don't have to worry about bombing of the railway and having so many unnecessary disruption to operations. Even in August, the DSS reported that there was plan again to bomb it again. You can imagine that. So this type of news, it's not good. That's something we can do. We don't need to talk to the World Bank about it. We don't need to talk to China or US or anybody about it. That's an inside job, like I was saying. And then finally, I think it's also important that we have very serious commitment to being able to negotiate very, very good deals. As a consultant that has worked with several governments, mostly in the African context, I can see clear difference between some countries and other countries in terms of how they negotiation. Some countries just don't even know how to approach this issue. They don't even understand, what the counterparty, has, what they cannot offer, whether they are bluffing and all of that. And when you see some of the research that they do in lead up to those negotiations, you'll be stunned. And that's what even Lola alluded to. In terms of negotiation, we are the ones going to take this loan or this credit. You have power, and you have to make sure that you are able to understand your circumstances, very well. I think Nigeria is a good example. We have to build far better negotiation capacity. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So last question to you, Mr. Taiwo. Sorry, I keep looking at you as Associated Press, so I will ask you in that line. Most of the scams, I will call them scams, that we hear abroad, the Halliburton, the Malabo, the P&ID, usually they emanate from Associated Press, from foreign press. What do you think internally we can do, investigative journalism, to improve our capacity to be exposing this kind of scandals, that why it shouldn't be coming from outside, that's when we'll all start jumping around, trying to think of how to solve the problem. What do we do to be exposing our own internal problems with regards to contracts, procurement processes, and all these problems that we have?
Yeah, thank you very much. Would that be the last question to me? Okay, yeah, thank you. Before I joined the Associated Press, I used to be a journalist at Premium Times. I was Peter's investigations and data editor. So on behalf of my colleagues who still work with national newspapers and networks, I would say that is not exactly correct. Yeah, Nigerian journalists, they have done very terrific stuff, exposing scams, exposing regulatory failure, exposing corruption. I think the problem, essentially, I'll come back to our home problem, but the problem generally is that when colleagues produce this quality journalism exposing wrongdoing, there is not enough use of that output by the civil society and the citizen. Yeah. At Premium Times, I exposed the railway scam in Nigeria. The Eastern Rail Line from Port Harcourt to Maiduguri. Contracts were awarded that the project be revived, and the president, the vice president took turns to commission lots, different sections of the project. And the contractor was even asking the government that he had overworked, and therefore the government should pay him 5 billion naira or something. But Premium Times, I actually exposed that. I went from Port Harcourt to Duku in Gombe State, literally showing that this guy did not even do up to 100 kilometers, whereas he was claiming that he had done 700 kilometers. And what did I do? This is a journalism place, so it should also be a learning opportunity. What I did first was to consult railway engineers, experts, asking them, okay, if I want to know that a rail line has been fixed, how do I know? If I want to know that it has not been fixed, how do I know? And they told me 3 things. One, every track you see will have 3 things. One, the maker, the year, and model. So because that Eastern Line was originally built by the Brits before the independence, the year you would see there would be like 1905, 1950, 1960. The ones that should have been recently done would have like 2013, 2014. The old ones, because again, built by the Brits, it's B60. The new one should be C16 by the Chinese, So what I did from Port Harcourt to Duku, literally, was just to check, and speaking with communities. And we calculated everything. This is less than 100 kilometers. So it was because of that that the government had to re-award the contract and ask the contractor to, return money. So there's a lot of investigative journalism going on in Nigeria. The problem we have actually is the civil society, is the citizens valuing the work we are producing. 1. 2, also, is saying that, they are doing it because it's not, like bringing political narrative. I led the Pandora Papers, the Nigerian reporting. Sorry, please.
No, we need to round up.
No, I will round off, yeah. And when some of these reports were produced, you hear like, it's because they don't want this guy to be this, they don't want them to be that. Yeah, so 2 things to respond to you quickly. 1, so first, we also have to improve our own capacity to carry out investigative journalism. Absolutely, we have to do that. We have to go beyond scratching the surface, just reporting, he said, she said, to actual what's going on. And this Chinese project, give example again. How many reports have we seen about not using the Abuja metro line? How many reports have we seen? How many reports have we seen about the efficiency and effectiveness of the Lagos rail line? How many reports have we seen about what happens to communities when there is no impact assessment? What happens to communities that have suffered? And lastly, sorry, I'm going to add this. I know Madam Lola has talked about what you have to do about neutralizing effect of corrosive capital. But one thing that Nigeria and many other African countries should also do is to look for sustainable funding sources. Some of the issues that we have, they are compatible with climate change goals. If you are building railway, for instance, it means that you are taking several cars off the road, and that is reducing emissions. So
okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. So, Mr. Eguegu, your last question, to draw from the question I gave him, what he explained was more of project monitoring and implementation. What role does the media play when we're taking these loans? When President Muhammad Buhari came in 2015, I think our debt profile then was about $43 to $50 billion. By the time he left, it was $103 billion, and they are printed money left, right, and center, and everywhere. So where were we when those things, because we're all media here, where were we to ensure that such things, before you take loans, before you even go to the level of whether the project has been implemented or not, what role do we play, civil society, to ensure that before you take a dime, that there's that due diligence has clearly been done. And like I told you about 2 weeks ago, the President Bola Ahmed Tinubu took another loan. President Muhammadu Buhari, before he left, the Minister of Finance took another $800 million loan. And all those loans, nobody can really tell you. So where do we plug in the gaps, not just the implementation process? Thank you. That's the last question.
Yeah, thank you. I think, we have a general problem with governance in this country, and issues of accountability and transparency. These are major challenges. So it's not, whether it's looking at infrastructure development or development projects that and programs that the government is doing, that's really is the issue. When the panel on health was talking, it's very brilliant points made around whether how health facilities are not being built, or health workers are not available to do the job. Because somewhere along the line, I think people got really demoralized with the kind of corruption. Every administration has its own story. It has its own scandal. It has, hopefully we don't see a scandal in this one, but maybe in under 8 years from today, we might be hearing something nobody knows. But you can check all the administration, there's always something big that nobody knew was happening because of the secrecy, and then at the end of the day, the information starts coming out. Or some people knew it was happening, they were ringing the alarm, but not enough traction. So generally, just to conclude, I would say people know, and we have all of the whistleblower acts. I think that's something that has really died down very recently. That's something that can be revived. There are people in this country that know where the problems are, what's happening, but they don't trust the system to actually pursue justice, or they don't trust the system to protect them if they are targeted. I think that is really the challenges that we're dealing with.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. You have been timing me just 2 questions. It was 3 questions, now back to 2. Am I supposed to do that? Okay. Whether you asked in the last session. Okay, so 1 from you. I got 1 from you. Okay, the last one. Please, questions, not comments. And you can address it to anybody. Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to seek for clarification in form of question. So as part of the President's engagement in Riyadh for the Africa-Saudi Summit, the Prince of the Saudi Kingdom has promised to rehabilitate our refineries and also make a substantial deposit in helping to enhance our liquidity, right? And sometimes we get to have these people make these commitments because you're talking about capital inflows, and our own part of the commitment are not being revealed. I have not seen, that's why I'm seeking clarification. So I'm asking, does this non-revelation of the commitment we're making, while these other people are making the commitment, does it affect the utilization of these foreign direct investments into the country? Thank you.
Okay. My name is Dickbo from Business Day. So just 2 questions. The first question is on... Okay. Okay, so let me pick the one I think would... Okay, so how do you handle unforeseen circumstances with foreign capital projects? So I give an instance, the Lekki Road. They were towing the road for a while, and then at some point, the NSAS incident happened, and so it means you can't...
What's the question, sir? The question.
So the question is, how do you deal with unforeseen circumstances for foreign capital projects like that?
Okay, Madam Lola will answer your question, Then Abimbola will answer your question. Is that okay? Okay, fine. Then we'll take the last one before I push the answer.
All right. My name is Yemi Sodiq. I actually want to direct my questions to Madam Lola. She made mention of the fact that some of the resources needed to build some infrastructure should be sourced locally. But I've listened to the former immediate past Minister of Works saying that sometimes the bitumen that they used to build roads, he was referring to Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, that they need to import some of these things. Like, is there any legislation that actually prevents, the fact that they're sourcing resources locally or foreign-wise? Thank you.
So, please.
So actually, Mr. Omar, you wanted me to specify exactly what we can do. And these questions, the how, these questions you asked, very brilliant questions, actually touch on them. So I'll quickly answer them. The first question about when there are unforeseen circumstances, and then you find yourselves like Mr. Eguegu was talking about what happened with the Kaduna Rail. You find yourselves incurring more losses instead of incurring or getting revenue that you can use to service the loans. And this is why it's very important to study the patterns of foreign investment coming to our countries and get very prepared for a different kind of negotiation strategy than we used to use before. We still go to the table negotiating the same way we used to negotiate aid and grant funding, things like the commitment that the first person who asked the question talked about. We get these commitments, we get very excited, we go home, we don't read the fine print. And with Chinese investment, a lot of the times, they can be in bold prints, they come in Mandarin. And many of the negotiators don't read Mandarin or Chinese Mandarin, right? And so the point I'm making, and when you were asking the question about unforeseen circumstances, as a lawyer, the first thing that came to my mind is, in a commercial contract, there's a standing clause called force majeure. We should be negotiating force majeure into these kinds of contracts because we are taking, not as a sovereign nation strictly, but as a commercial partner to these investors in these new transactions. And so the terms are harsher, or they are more, Beijing now has very strong terms around recouping the investments that they make in African countries because of the issues around paying back. So when force majeure happens, there should be a calculation in there. In the previous types of projects that are not contract-oriented, there are concessions. They will call them concessions. In commercial contracts, it is a force majeure. It's called an act of God. When it's an act of God, what can we do? How do we mitigate the loss that we who have to pay back experience? So that's one thing. Any commercial contract you take, you might contract with your bank, you might have any kind of arrangement. Make sure you search for a force majeure, because when there's a force majeure, there should be a hold on your repayment. So that's one answer to that. And it'll be interesting, as part of this research we're doing with CJID, to check how many of the commercial based contracts Nigeria has taken that have that sort of concession or force majeure clause. The second question on local content. In project finance, project infrastructure finance, or even any kind of project finance is the kind of financing in the industry that refers to the involvement of a state party, a private investor, or even a state investor, and a private sector company that does the construction. There are usually those three parties, and then there's the community. It's usually like public infrastructure finance. It could be a PPP type of project finance. It is a standard in the industry that local content sourcing is critical. And I believe if we have a project finance, I think we have a project finance law. I can't imagine local content sourcing is not in that law. Although if it's not, that's one of the things civil society should do. Advocate for that law to be amended. In the extractives industry, it's a standard, provision as well. Every country has that for very good and established reasons in many academic journals that you can find. So local content sourcing is critical. Now, it's not absolute, because you may not find all that local content in a country. It's only when you don't find it and you've made adequate effort to generate it, to develop it. So maybe you have the raw material, you need to add value, to process it. Only after you've done that, then you can source from other countries. And even then, it can come with conditions. For instance, you can't have tax waivers for importing it, for example, or custom tariff waivers, things like that. So it boils down to negotiation. But the simple answer to your question is, it's a standard practice, and if we don't negotiate it into our contract, then it's a low-hanging fruit. If we don't negotiate it into project finance contracts, it's a low-hanging fruit.
Round of applause for that response, please. Will you take the next question? Yeah.
And so to the last question, I would answer the how as well as the last question. For the last question, a simple, direct answer would be, first and foremost, when these announcements are made, we should not get excited. It's supposed to be backed, first of all, by a communique where the terms are stated, and then we will understand the quantum of investments that is coming, or investment cooperation that we're signing. Ahead of that, though, what we need to do as a country is the fact that we have to stop going around asking for funding or investment cooperation without actually evaluating the opportunity that is there. We have to sit and say, where are we in terms of our infrastructure state? What do we need to develop? Is this going into transportation? Is it going into road building? Is it going into healthcare facilities, for example? And based on that, with the intel that we have from trade and investment, we should be able to say which countries, which of the bilaterals can we actually leverage for an investment cooperation, or are we getting funds that will facilitate trade between the two countries, right? So a lot of times I think, or let me say fundamentally, we have to move away from utilizing debt, to sort out poverty alleviation issues in country. We cannot borrow money to start dashing out money to our people. We have to structure what we're asking for in terms of which is coming as debt. If we get grants, we can give grants, we can dash people money, we can give out palliatives, but we cannot borrow money to give palliatives to the people. It's just wrong, because you're borrowed based on certain terms and then you're dashing out based on no terms. It doesn't work in any way, and we will be further impoverished. So as the media, this is now where you come in. You are the accountability champions for the masses, right? You need to be able to find, I think there has to be more funding going into research for media people, so that you also get to understand, if we're going to Saudi, why are we going to Saudi? And then whatever the outcome of Saudi is has to match the purpose for which we went there, right? We can't just go around cap in hand, begging for funds, just to solve our immediate problems. And this takes me back again to our long-term strategy. We need a lot. We need to we need, financial appraisers that will look at what we're doing. We need the economic aspect has to be considered in a very holistic way. We can't just say, oh, we have this problem, we need to solve it. We're just going to go to Switzerland and get a few funds and solve it. No, it doesn't work that way. And then the M&E is critical. And media also needs to work hand in hand with M&E companies so that these things are brought out, and the transparency, you have to drive or increase the transparency of the processes of governance for Nigeria, because that then holds the government to accountability, and I think we'll begin to do things better. I'll end on this note, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. So in conclusion, just the summary, less than a minute. What we have concluded this session is that we just need better negotiation strategies where they will be nationalistic in our strategies, and of course include the force majeure clause, because this is a commercial contract. That's very important. The second thing, very important, is we need to improve our level of transparency and ensure the inclusion of citizens when taking these loans for whatever reasons we're taking loans. We have also forgotten that state governors also to go and take these loans without consulting the people at the subnational level by discussing at the federal level. So that's another problem. And the third thing is we need to continue strengthening our rule of law. That is a continuous thing, so we need to just continue doing that. Then in conclusion, the last thing she said, we should borrow for capital expenditure and not recurrent. You just don't borrow money, take people's BVL account and put whatever you want to put. So it should just be for capital purposes. So thank you very much, Madam Lola, Madam Abimbola, Eguegu, and Mr. Taiwo. Thank you very much for your time. And the audience, thank you too for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, distinguished panelists, for this awesome session. Let's have a photo session now. Could you kindly stand and make a pose? All right, paparazzi, are we ready?